Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Joan Woodward, president of the Travelers Institute. Welcome to Wednesdays with Woodward, where we convene leading experts for conversations about today's biggest challenges, personal and professional. Before we get started, I'd like to share our disclaimer about today's program. I'd also like to thank our webinar partners today, the MetroHartford Alliance and the Insurance Association of Connecticut. So now let's get started. As one of our first programs in 2023, we decided to take stock of the economy, where we've been and where we're headed. After a year of rockiness around numerous economic indicators, we're all looking to make sense of these trends beyond the headlines and to figure out what it really means for our businesses and actually, more importantly, for our families. So will you be able to hire the workers you need in 2023? How long will inflationary pressures persist? Again, both in your business and in your personal life, and much more we're going to talk about today. So I'm thrilled and honored to welcome a special guest today, my longtime friend, Dr. LaVaughn Henry, to help provide perspective on it all. Dr. LaVaughn Henry has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and has a long career in public service. Early on in his career, he worked on Capitol Hill for the House Budget Committee. That's where we first met nearly 30 years ago. He has served as some of the country's top financial institutions, including Fannie Mae, the Federal Reserve, where he served as vice president for the Cincinnati branch office of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. From 2019 to 2021, Dr. Henry served as senior economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He is currently the chairman of the Foundation of the National Association of Business Economists. He presents regularly on the outlook for the economy, monetary policy, and the residential real estate market. All topics we're looking forward to discussing with him today. So he's going to kick us off with an opening presentation, and then I'm going to rejoin him to keep the conversation rolling. We're going to take your questions, of course, so don't wait. Put your questions for LaVaughn in that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So first, LaVaughn, you are a young rock star when I first met you, and now you're a distinguished rock star in the economics field. And I just want to thank you for your many, many decades of public service. So the virtual floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, my friends. So what I would like to do is talk about, as I said, the status and outlook of the U.S. economy. Now, as Joan did, I would also like to make a disclaimer that the views expressed herein are solely those of myself, the author, and also the presenter. All information upon which this presentation is based was obtained from publicly available sources that are considered reliable. Okay? So why don't we get started and talk about what we will be talking about. And there, we're speaking of the presentation outline. First, the labor market. Cut to the chase, America strong. Then, everyone's speaking about now? Inflation. Where we were in the past, where we are today, where we're moving toward in the future. Then move to the elephant in the room, that being personal consumption. Why do I term it as such? That's 70% of the US economy, and so goes consumption, so goes our economy. Then let's speak about business performance, earnings and investment. Been somewhat of an underwhelming quarter, however, could be much worse, and the outlook is not that bad. And finally, bringing it back down, risk factors to the outlook. Progress always involves risk. We're in a risky period to move up or down, but, and you will come to see in my bias, I believe we're still heading up. So, that all being said, my friends, let's move to our first slide, America Strong. If we look at the path of the unemployment rate and earnings, what we see is that the unemployment rate is currently at a historical low of 3.4%, the lowest it's been, at least in the last 10 years, but specifically in the last 50 years, 50 plus years. 1969 was the last time we had to see such a low unemployment rate. And we're seeing average hourly earnings continue to rise despite pessimism from the broad population about the outlook. This is a strong labor market, no matter how we cut it. Now, if we look farther, let's look at why are we seeing such strong movement? Well, fundamentally, we are in a period of strong economic growth. The U.S. economy continues to grow. We saw 2.9% growth last quarter. That's the advanced read in the GDP, after a growth in the third quarter and slight declines in the first 2 quarters of last year. So we're on a path of strong growth. As I said, unemployment remains low. Business investment, companies are continuing to invest despite rising interest rates and increased uncertainty on the future path. Tax and regulatory policies are a mix. Yes, we are in a highly regulated environment, but in the near term, we have seen some substantial fiscal policy moves, such as the infrastructure bill, the CHIP Act bill, and others that will help us grow into the future. I can't say enough about consumer spending, the all-in, all-important, and global competition remains strong. Now, our trading partners are not as strong as us for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, we still continue to see expansion on a global basis. So if we now look with respect to inflation, what everyone's talking about, where does that put us? Yes, if we go back to the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen inflation rise substantially, okay? Peaking out at 9.1% in the summer of last year. We had not seen inflation advance at this rate in this time period. I mean, during a short time period since the late 1970s, early 1980s. I'll tell my age there. I actually recall that because I was just starting out in college in economics, and I remember the period quite well. But let's see what we've seen since then. We have seen now 4 consecutive, if not 5 consecutive months of declines in inflation. And that's key. That's key because as we've seen the Federal Reserve bring to bear its many tools to pull back demand, to pull back economic activity to a more reasonable, sustainable level, we have seen us enter a period of disinflation. Now, I want to make sure that we understand disinflation is not deflation. We are not seeing negative price growth. We're just seeing a slowing in the amount of growth, okay? And the amount of growth in prices. And if we look at the Fed's preferred measure, that being the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, we're actually down to the area of about 5.5% inflation. But still, that's not where they want to be. That's not where we need to be. There's still much heavy lifting to be done. Now, if we look at what the Fed is predicting in their series of their quarterly communications, which we will see an update next month, they're predicting over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, okay, a return to target inflation levels of 2% by 2025. And that's a range. If you look at the midpoint of their predicted range, they're looking for year-end levels of approximately 3.5%, and then moving down sequentially over the next couple of years. If you look at it on a core basis, pretty much in the same path, moving out toward 2025 to back to a period of stability. The infamous dot plot. And for those who may not know what this is, the Federal Reserve puts out, once again, every quarter, the summary assessments of the members of the Board of Governors and the presidents of each of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, their expectations for midpoint estimates of the Fed funds rate and as it adjusts into the longer term. So each one of those dots is a member of the board or the Federal Reserve Banks. And as you can see, we have greater variation as we move out through time. But nonetheless, we see continued decline, predicted decline in the rate of inflation. And that's what you want to see. You want to see, sure, it go away tomorrow, eggs be back to where they were a year ago, but adjustment takes time. Monetary policy takes time. Where does this show us moving to in the long term? Out in the longer run, back to the level of 2 to 2.5%. In the near term, 5%, 4%, 3% moving down. Now, what's causing this inflation? Well, if we look at it, there are 5 major issues. The demand pull inflation. We are consuming so much more than we were, even pre-pandemic now, okay? You may recall that we saw significant rise in retail sales this morning. Cost push. This relates to supply chains disruptions and an issue with respect to globalization, reverse globalization, as we see operating costs rise for producers. Monetary inflation. There was a lot of monetary accommodation during the period of the pandemic to keep us from going into a significant recession, and it worked. And now they're pulling back. That matters. Exchange rate inflation and supply chain disruptions as we move forward. Okay. Now, if we look at the next, like I said, elephant in the room, how are we doing on consumption? That all-in important measure. Consumption is 70% of the American economy. I like to say that if you took consumption, just that segment, what we as American consumers do, it's 70% of the US economy. That is approximately the size of the entire Chinese economy. And I say that because that's now the number 2 economy in the world. So that's how much power we as consumers have to dictate the future of the US and the global economy. And as you can see, retail sales remain strong, back to levels, rising at levels as they were pre-pandemic. Again, I say this morning's number showed 6.4% in advanced retail sales since a year ago, up from also December. And real personal consumption expenditures, again, very steady. Can this continue? We can hope, but at this point, it looks, given the strength of the aforementioned labor market and the other factors been put in place by fiscal policy, there is no, on the near term, show that consumption should be falling in any dramatic way, with the exception of consumer sentiment, and we'll speak about that. Now, this speaks a little bit to the issue of cost push and supply chain issues. For the longest, we were in a situation we didn't have enough inventory to meet demand. We did not. As you can see, after the onset of the pandemic and the adjustment period soon thereafter, we saw inventory levels drastically decline. Okay. If you look here, we saw it decline to approximately 1.2 by the beginning of 2021 from a 1.4 ratio, which is approximately historically the norm. But since then, we've seen continued growth in inventories, and that takes pressure off of inflationary issues, inflationary factors. But also introduces, and we may speak about that later, other issues such as where do you store this increased inflation? Because we are seeing, this increased inventory, because we are seeing pressure on warehouse rates that can feed back and increase inflation from that standpoint. So we've spoken about this, and why don't we stay on time and now move to business performance. How are business profits and investments doing? Now, even in this situation, in this environment of rising interest rates, we have seen business investment still stay strong. Through the most recent numbers, we're seeing gross private domestic investment rise at a little less than a 10% year-over-year rate. Profits having come down from astronomical levels early in 2021, now running at about 5% growth of thereabouts. Okay, so we're seeing movement down, but still in the positive territory. Now, a lot of this, keep in mind, keep in mind that a lot of the profits that we're seeing are from sectors that really benefited from the reopening of the economy. But as we see increased fear, as we see higher interest rates, as we see increased consumer sentiment about will we be going into recession, how long will the Fed be making its adjustments, that puts risk into the conversation. That makes business step back and say, hey, do we need to be investing so much right now when we're not sure about consumer demand? So that's why we're seeing the movement down in profits. But as long as consumer demand stays positive, we have a strong labor market, and we do not see, in my opinion, a hard landing, but rather a soft landing by the Federal Reserve. Corporate profits should stay in the reasonable range, and hopefully soon thereafter, later this year, move up in a more stronger fashion. Okay. Now, is there risk to this forecast? Well, definitely so. Definitely so. The biggest risk is the inflation. We are seeing what we have not seen in the last 40 years. A period of high inflation, but now a period of disinflation. We're seeing an aggressive Federal Reserve raising rates to address that issue of inflation, but doing it so in a very thoughtful and prudent manner that's already achieving results. We continue to pursue solid trade policies, but it's been slowed. It has been slowed by issues between ourselves, China, and other global parties. Remains political uncertainty, what will happen on the Hill, and internationally, and the global economic conditions still are fraught with uncertainty. I believe one of the biggest issues we have to deal with, and this is not new, is what happens with federal debt by the early summer. And the shock, you can never rule out there being some kind of disaster. So, natural disaster, let's say. So, my friends, what I'd like to say in summary is that if we look at the current situation that faces us, we are in a very solid position, but an uncertain future. And that uncertainty belies what we've seen, but a lot of what we might see in the future. Okay? Now, our host, Travelers Institute, has put together a lot of questions for us. Hopefully I answered them correctly, or at least reasonably. And I would like to turn back to my friend, Joan. Joan?
LaVaughn, thank you so very much. I just love the cadence of how you speak. And, you don't have to have a PhD in economics to understand exactly where you're headed with each of these topics. And they're complicated. And so I love how you can explain it to folks like us that don't have a PhD from Harvard. So thank you for that. And the content you delivered was really, just really interesting because, as you say, we're in such a period of, historically, we haven't seen periods like this before. So Thank you for that. And like I always do, I like to turn the tables on our audience before we get started into the discussion and ask them a couple questions. There's only two today. So the first question for everyone out there, if you could please vote. What economic factors or issues are you most concerned about in 2023? What are you most concerned about in your business? Let's just maybe stick to business at the moment, but of course it affects our personal lives, as everyone knows. So the number one factor you're most concerned about, and it looks like from our results here, inflation. Over 50% of the audience has said inflation clearly, but geopolitical factors. I mean, there's so much that we don't control, right, LaVaughn? And in our country, there's so many other external factors out there that affect inflation or labor issues or, supply chain. So what do you make of these answers? Obviously, it doesn't surprise you on the inflation front, right? But what surprises you here?
Well, what surprises me is that we had, and it's definitely not in the primary, is that we had so many people concerned about labor issues when that is our strongest area in the economy right now, the labor market. But with inflation, sure, it's an unknown. Many in your audience probably was not alive at the time we last saw any significant inflation in this country. But something to also put out there in the ecosphere right now is that it doesn't turn on a dime when you talk about inflation, when you talk about how things will happen in the future. Great. Coming off the inflation of the early 1980s, it took close to 6 years, almost a decade, to get down, okay? And we have similarities there, we have differences there. The other one, the geopolitical risk, that's an issue because we can't control that. We can't control what's happening. We can influence, but we can't control what's going to happen over in Eastern Europe. We can't control what Xi Jinping is going to do because he just wants to do it. And that all has an impact on a very globalized economy. So no, I see those outcomes as consistent.
I'm going to guess that when someone chose labor issues here, LaVaughn, I'm going to guess they're concerned about labor issues because they have to pay their employees more. And because employees have more power now, post-pandemic, the employee has the power and wages are going up. So I'm going to guess that people who chose labor issues were worried about that dynamic, not the fact that unemployment rate is at a historic lows, right?
I agree.
Okay,
I totally agree.
Let's go on to the next question because we have one more question for our audience here. When do you expect inflationary pressures to subside? Do you think they're going to subside this year, later this year? Or do you think it's going to take till 2024 or later to subside? Let's see what our audience says. This is our last polling question. So we appreciate everyone participating. It looks to me like we only have about 20% of the audience thinking it's going to subside this year, LaVaughn. Is that consistent with what you're thinking? You said it took 6 years?
I think it's very consistent. As I just said, it's not an overnight thing. Plus, we are looking at some structural issues we were not looking at in previous periods. I think that's a very reasonable assessment. Now, I wouldn't say that we'll see the Federal Reserve just continue to raise rates forever, and we'll talk about that. But I do believe that's a very reasonable expectation to 2024 or later.
Okay, so now let's get into some questions. We talked about, does this economic period in any way mirror any historical periods that you saw? You just said it took 6 years, almost 10 years to really get out of the inflationary pressures of 1980s. What does this period in time remind you of historically, economically?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Joe. It reminds me of the period of early to mid 1980s, the quote unquote Reagan era, which was a solid era for our country. Okay, it was morning in America in many ways. Similarities, going through a period of disinflation, coming off a high inflationary period of the late 70s, early 1980s. 2, similar in terms of economic uncertainty, followed by strong economic growth. We had been in a situation we didn't really know much about, and the Fed was testing new ideas. Okay, something also put in context. We're right now at 4.75 on the Fed funds effective rate. You know what the Fed funds rate was back then? 19.1%. Okay, very different. And we're also similar in that there is declining unemployment. Very similar. Differences? We are very much different in terms of labor market rigidity. There was very much rigidity in the early 1980s due to wage contracts, inability to move from sector to sector. Now that's not the case. Plus the composition of our labor force. We used to be a production economy. We built things. Now we're a service economy. We do things that help in the process. Those are very different in how you move wages around, how you move people around. The regulatory environment, very different from then to now. That was a period of decreasing regulation, which helps to pull price pressures down. We are in some ways a period of rising regulation. Not across the board, and some of these regulations really did work, a la Dodd-Frank. But at the end of the day, we're in a rising regulatory environment. And also the degree of international globalization, very key here. That in the 80s and 90s helped us to get the costs down. But now we're seeing some of our global trading partners pull back and want to do it different. And hey, we have this other Asian competitor now that we did not have then. And we're bringing stuff back, not in a massive way, but we are. So that helps push prices up. So there's similarities and there are differences.
Really, really interesting. Really, thank you for breaking that down. People do forget how high mortgage rates were back in the 1980s, et cetera. So I want to talk about what economic indicators our audience should look to when what are the things that you keep a close eye on? A lot of people say, well, if the yield curve inverts, the difference between the 2 and the 10-year, if the yield curve inverts, we're absolutely going to have a recession within 6 to 12 months. People say a leading economic indicator is the consumer confidence number. People feeling confident in their own economic situation, they're going to buy more things. Our GDP is going to go up. What do you watch, and what should my audience watch to see whether we're headed up or we're headed down?
Thanks very much. Well, we can never bank on anything, one single number telling us where the future is going to be. It just doesn't work that way because the yield curve has been inverted for a good amount of time now. Okay, it bounces in and out, but it's been inverted for a little while. Some people say, well, if you have 2 quarters in a row, that's a recession. That's really not how recessions get called. Let's look at the economic fundamentals. I can never say enough. Personal consumption, retail sales, that's what drives this economy. If you start seeing consumers pull back in a significant way, that's the start of the process. If we start seeing the unemployment rate tick up in a substantial manner and non-farm payroll employment start declining versus having these strong months, which is really off the chart, 517,000 last month, that's an indicator. If inflation starts to reverse, okay, like right now, we just came in, it was really weak, a weak decline, but still it's a decline from 6.5 to 6.4 month to month. If we start seeing that it sticks then around that level, then we may see the Fed going, get stronger, and other measures, institute a supply management, manufacturing survey. And most important, in my humble opinion, listen to what the Fed says. These Federal Reserve statements, they're signaling where they're going to go. And where they go is where this economy is going to go. So look at the fundamentals. It's almost like if you want to make money in the stock market, listen to Buffett. Don't listen to whoever's the catchphrase of the day. Okay?
Long-term
exactly.
thinking.
Long-term.
Right. Long-term. We're in this for the long term.
Yes.
Good. Okay, we're going to move on because I have over 100 questions coming in now for you from the audience, but I want to focus on Geopolitical risk. We both talked about it. Certainly, the U.S. the economy is impacted by what's going on overseas. Talk to me about three things: China, and China with COVID and their incredible lockdowns they've had over the last 3 years. The fraught Chinese relationship, maybe with Taiwan, and how that could potentially affect us. And then Russia and Ukraine. So I want to break it down to three different. So let's talk about China and COVID, and then China and the geopolitical risks with Taiwan kind of first. Or maybe what are they funding now, potentially funding the war in Ukraine or funding North Korea? Tell us why that impacts us.
Okay, here's why it matters, in my humble opinion. China and COVID is almost like the never-ending story. We've seen it since 2020. And when China goes into its lockdown mode, that affects us by cutting supplies to the United States. Now, I may be more hopeful here than fact, but I want to believe that Xi Jinping, the premier, learned that that hurts him also. So right now we're in a phase where they're opening up again, but let's see how long it lasts, okay? But it's an issue from the trade relations and also their relationships with some of our partners being frayed and trying to push into that. That's another issue. All right, and that leads to our Chinese-US relations. Tale of two cities. We have the good, we have the bad. I totally agree with our President Biden, that we need to emphasize that we're seeking competition, not conflict. Over the long term, no one wins with conflicts. But if we can put trade policies in place that are respectful of both sides, we can both move better. It's kind of like making the pie bigger through a competitive means, not through conflict. So let's see where those go. And finally, the Russia-Ukraine war, let's just call it what it is, the Russian invasion, the unjust war. We have to keep our finger on that. Although it has not necessarily minimal, but doesn't have significant impacts on us from an economic standpoint today, except with the issue of keeping fuel prices higher than they otherwise would be. Let someone make a mistake and advance that war onto NATO protected territory. Then all issues become global. Then all issues, where do we go from there? Okay, I think overuse of the term, it goes nuclear, is ridiculous, but we cannot afford to have that war become a contagion in Europe. That concerns me. But I believe we definitely need to continue supporting Ukraine because it's the right thing to do from not just a geopolitical standpoint, but from an economic standpoint.
Okay, thank you for that trip around the world. Let's hope all those global hotspots, do improve. I want to shift focus and go to Washington because you and I both live in Washington, and yep. Your government experience is golden. It puts you in a great place to talk about what's going on with the debt ceiling standoff. You've seen this movie before, I know. Yep. I have, working on the House Budget Committee. So how does this get resolved? And if it doesn't get resolved, what are the grave implications for what if we breach the debt ceiling? Like, people talk about the debt ceiling as if, but there's actual consequences. And when would we expect that? They're saying maybe late June, maybe into July. How do you see this shaking out? And what would be your advice to Kevin McCarthy and President Biden to come together to get it resolved?
Excellent question. Now, I've got to give a shout out to Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, because basically ain't no mountain high enough when it comes to discussing public debt. And we can't have this continuing to go up. An interesting thing here, public debt, the growth in public debt is a bipartisan issue. If we look at the last, 7 presidents since 1981, when the debt was $1 trillion, which has now grown to $31.4 trillion, we actually see a split between the R's and the D's, with the Republicans accounting for 57%. of the growth in the debt, and the Democrats 43%. And actually, time in office accounts for about the same, 57 and 43%. So it's an issue of, can we get to where we need to be without breaching that ceiling of 31.4? Why wouldn't we want to do that? Because then everything goes over the edge. Interest rates will skyrocket. We would lose our debt rating, okay, that we have, which is supreme. So our ability to continue funding debt or even funding what we've done is brought into jeopardy. We would no longer be the world's gold standard. And at the same time, we would have to then start making substantial cuts to our budget in a dramatic way. So the debt ceiling matters, but it's not a topic that should be lightly played with on Capitol Hill, that, ooh, let's just do it and see what happens. No, this stuff matters. Now, in my humble opinion, both parties are right and both parties are wrong. And I'm not trying to be political on this, but I'm just stating it as it is. I think the Ds are correct in their position that the debt ceiling is far too important to be negotiated with. It's far too important for long-term economic credibility. And it can be damaged by a short-term political stunt. I think they're wrong on the flip side of staking out a position that they will not negotiate. At the end of the day, you know as I do, Joan, everything's a negotiation in Washington, everything. On the R's, I think they're right in that we need to get a better handle on our discretionary spending as it grows in a substantive way that tames future spending and taxation, tame future growth in the debt. I think they're wrong saying that they will not pass a debt ceiling compromise unless the Ds negotiate. So you may ask, okay, if they're both right and they're both wrong, how do we get to where we need to go? Well, here's my humble opinion. I think the answer can be achieved by looking back in the past at what we did before. Such an approach could be the establishment of a bipartisan and bicameral commission tasked with two primary missions. One is to discuss and develop legislation, policy and legislation, to deal with the entitlements. That's the solvency of the entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicaid. The second mission would be to develop policy and legislation that deals with discretionary spending and tax policy separable from the entitlements, with an agreement that the commission would come to life post the passage of the debt ceiling agreement and sunset, i.e. come up with the conclusion by the beginning, no later than the beginning of the 119th Congress, a la January 2025, with the goal of establishing policy, establishing the rules in that first 6 months after the new Congress takes office. That separates out the debt ceiling from the discretionary argument, and it deals with the issues of how we deal with the entitlement programs. So let's see if Washington does it.
And we've had experience with
Yes,
bicameral, bipartisan commissions, the Erskine-Bowles, Simpson-Bowles Commission, or the National Entitlement Commission, back when our friend Mark Weinberger, who was CEO of EY, just retired, he was head of that. And they really came up with deficit reducing and kind of political cover, right? So the politicians could vote, right? And so it does make sense. Great suggestion.
When you have everyone at the table, everyone's got skin in the game, that's how you get progress.
Great. Okay, let's shift a bit because I have a lot of questions coming in about the real estate market. But first, let's talk about what do you make of all these companies? Every day you wake up, turn on CNBC, or at least I do every morning, and you see all the layoffs. A lot of the layoffs in these companies, and if we're laying off people, LaVaughn, that unemployment, that labor force number is going to start to swing and go the other way. Are you worried about these recent layoffs in a lot of these large companies?
I could be more worried than I am. And I'm not minimizing that because as a person who early in their career suffered through a layoff, okay, during an economic downturn, I understand their pain. However, what we're seeing in terms of layoffs right now is largely, but not 100%, but largely contained to the tech sector, which is a small sector in this economy. And the majority of the people there are not being laid off, okay? So that's one factor. Now, when we start seeing contagion, moving to other sectors of the economy, such as the big sectors, which are business and service employment and leisure hospitality and retail and trade sales, different issues there, retail and wholesale sales, I'm sorry. That's a different issue, okay? But we haven't really seen much of that yet. As I say, the market is very strong right now on the labor side. As long as consumption stays solid, I don't expect there to be a significant issue of layoffs broad-based.
Great to hear it. So what are the shocks? Let's talk about the worst case scenario. What are the shocks to our system that keeps you up at night? What are the things that we should look for? Obviously, if these layoffs become contagious and more manufacturing companies and other financial services companies start the layoffs, so that's maybe one shock. What are the other shocks that you think we should look out for? Or what are you worried about?
Okay. Anytime I hear people speak of shocks, I remember a professor of mine in graduate school back at Harvard used to say, well, shocks aren't predictable. That's why they're called shocks. Okay, so myself being a person who always has an opinion, and sometimes they're right, if I had to worry about a shock, my big shock would be something happens on the Hill and in the White House that they let the debt ceiling get crossed. As I say, that's what would send us over the edge. And then I would believe that recession is almost inevitable.
And LaVaughn, let me stop you there. Let me just stop you there. So if we reach the debt ceiling, what happens the next day? What actually happens to our economy? Is it the Chinese stop buying our debt? We can't issue debt? What actually happens?
We can't issue debt. That's the big issue right there. Keep in mind that I can't remember the percentage, but what is about a third of our budget is debt funded? Okay, I think it's about a third, somewhere like that. That very next day, we cannot fund any new or ongoing programs if we don't have the money already in the bank, okay? So we immediately have a shock to outlays that help support this economy. We immediately have a shock to the credibility of our system, and therefore we see market yields rise significantly, okay? So if that limit gets crossed, we have an immediate shock. Now, does that mean that Social Security payments get stopped? Medicare gets stopped? Well, no, not immediately. But when politicians get, and you know this, when they get pressed against the wall, they sometimes do some very strange things. Okay, so that's something to consider. That's just one of those you don't want to cross. Okay, now the second one I've already spoken to. If that war gets moved to NATO territory, that's a shock. That's a shock because that puts everyone in stall mode, and that means reduced international trade, higher energy prices, slower economic growth. Not to mention all the people who get killed and died like that, but that's what happens. Okay, did I answer your question, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that was the pessimistic shocks, but I think it's important for people to understand if they're watching the news show and this, you're saying what would happen, the consequences if there is that kind of shock that hits our system. Okay, we have to move on. Lots of questions around the housing market. A lot of people want to know. So mortgage rates went from 3% a year and a half ago or so to 6% plus. And during the pandemic, we had a shortage of inventory. So our prices, all the housing prices, it was definitely a seller's market. So where are we today in terms of housing prices? Are they still going to be continuing to trend upward, even with mortgage rates going up? Are people not putting their houses on the market because we have an inventory problem now? So they're not moving because mortgage rates are higher. How do you think about the Fed action with regard to the housing market? Because it's really been one of the most resilient during the pandemic.
Yes. Well, we actually in this country have a long-term housing problem, okay? And we've had it for years. As the interest rates have moved up, and that issue really is the issue of affordability. It's affordability. And the affordability issue is the child of many bad decisions in the housing market and natural market phenomena. And the natural market phenomena is when we came out of the Great Recession in 2010 and thereafter, we had so many people leave the housing construction markets because of opportunities elsewhere in the labor market, because of rising rates, okay? So builders pulled back, and we have never caught up with building houses at the rate we need to build houses to bring in new individuals to the housing market in an affordable way. So that started our shortage of housing, which has been now running for 10 plus years. And on top of that, now a rising rate environment, making the existing short supply of houses even more expensive to purchase. So what we've seen, given just those two factors alone, and there are other factors I can go into, is a continued increase, a rapid increase in the price of housing, which peaked in early 2022, okay? And now we're starting to see some pullback because affordability has gotten so out of whack. Okay, I saw an NAR number now that's less than, it's running at like 96, but I won't go into what that means. But at the end of the day, what does that mean for the long run? It means young people will have continued difficulty getting into that first all-important home, either having to settle for a home that is less than their preferred level, or just not going into homeowner ownership whatsoever. And I'm a big believer in the value of home ownership, okay? If it wasn't for my parents going into a home when I was like 7 or 8, I don't believe I would have gotten to where I am today, because I know community matters and housing and ownership matters. Now, you could argue also that this is a short-term phenomenon, but have we both been economists for a long time, Joe? Define short-term, medium, and long-term. Who knows? But there are some demographic shifts that can help this problem over the long term. Baby boomers, we are aging, pulling out of single-family ownership, maybe into homes, and some are passing away. That's almost inevitable. At some point, they all will pass away. Those are a lot of homes that come on the market. So if you just look at the mismatch there, that older persons own the majority of homes, but they're aging out of the cohort, that should put pressure on prices as we move, pressures down as we move forward. Now, cut to the chase. This year, if we see 5%, and this number is just not pulled out of the air, but I was looking at CoreLogic S&P Schiller number yesterday. They're predicting about 3% growth over the course of the next year, which is substantially below last year, which is 6.9%, which was substantially below what it was the year before. So a softening housing market, we could use that. It will make it more affordable and more young people get into the market. Okay.
So a couple of young people have since you were answering that question, texted me saying, so it sounds like Dr. Henry is telling us, get in, just get in. We know interest rates are higher than you want them to be. Prices may still be too high, but if you get in now, it's better than waiting 5 years. Is that your view?
That is my view. Okay. Prices will always rise. It's really what happens on a real dollar basis that matters. Okay. But nominal prices will always rise. In fact, I like to put money where the mouth is. Both of my sons purchased their first home last year. Yeah, it was a struggle, but they did it, and they're already seeing the benefits of it, both community and price-wise. So things happen. Things matter.
Great. I'll have them talk to my 4 kids.
Okay.
So let's shift again, because I have a lot of questions coming in from the audience on this topic, which is supply chain. And I know we spoke about China and the war, but in your view, do you think that the supply chain issues, the challenges are starting to subside? We obviously passed the CHIPS Act, getting more domestic chip makers here in the US. We don't have to rely so much on offshore chip making. We saw the prices of used cars going up dramatically during the pandemic, and a shortage of even buying new cars. So do you think these supply chain issues have subsided and we're headed down the path of normality, or do you think this is a new phenomenon for the economy?
Well, I would like to be Pollyannish on this, but I can't be and be a valid economist. We're still muddling through. Okay. If you look at a recent survey, that just came out, I believe yesterday or a week ago, CNBC, they surveyed I can't remember the actual number of logistics managers, and the significant majority said that more than half, they are still having significant supply chain issues, and they don't expect it to return to normal for their companies until 2024 and beyond. Verbatim, 61% of respondents said their current supply chain is not operating normally, compared to 32% that said it's functioning normally. When questioned if they see a return to normalcy, 22% were unsure, 19% said 2023, 30% said 2024. There are still a lot of issues in the supply chain that have to be factored out. I mean, when we had things operating normally up until the point of the pandemic, it's because it took us years to get to that point. And that's what we have to remember. It took years to get to that point. You can't turn off an economy as big and as efficient and operating as soundly as the United States, and then in 6 months, turn it back on and say, okay, well, that's over. We're back. No, it takes time. Things take time. Markets change. People move in and out, and it takes time to get there. And we have a different geopolitical framework now we have to consider, and that's factoring into it also. So no, we're not done yet. We're making progress, but we're not done yet.
Okay, shifting again, we want to talk about artificial intelligence, which is the hot topic now. George Watts of Hub asked the question, what do you think of the economic impact of things like ChatGPT and other AI tools? Is this really a game changer in business?
I will tell you, I personally love ChatGPT. This isn't a shout out to just that tool, but those are the type of tools that can have substantial impact over the long run. People are worried, oh, it's going to take my job. No, it's going to make your job easier. That's like when personal computers came into vogue in the 1990s, the typists got worried. Well, guess what? It made their job easier. Anything that's in efficiency enhancing, that's productivity enhancing, and the long term benefits the market. It doesn't subtract from it. Okay. I think ChatGPT is a great thing. Now, things can't just be willy-nilly thrown out there without control. Okay. If they can pass medical boards and labor boards, we have to find a way to monitor this, because this may be an extension, but we will end up being some of the dumbest people in the world if we just have computers answer everything and we don't really know the underlying issues. So we have to find some way to control. But no, I think it's a very solid addition to our market. But
better than crypto. Okay, that's a good line. ChatGPT Better than crypto. Rapid fire, because we're running out of time. I want to get in a couple of last questions here for you. Giovanni Sharp of Lockton asked, what is the economic outlook for the construction industry? The federal funding of these huge infrastructure products, do you see that as inflationary? Do you see that as long overdue? Or do you see that as essential in terms of rebuilding our infrastructure so we could prosper more as society? Which camp are you in? Or maybe all three?
I'm in the last two. I don't view it as necessarily inflationary because let's just put that on the back burner. It's what we need to be doing. Who hasn't driven over a pothole and lost a tire? I've lost a lot. Maybe I need to stop driving over potholes. But the long story short is we are significantly behind in the infrastructure in this country. It has to be done. I believe it will bring some key jobs that need to be done in this country by all classes in this country. Okay. And I think that's key. I think that's so important because everyone has to participate in economic growth, not just an elite few. So I am all in for infrastructure. The faster we do it, the better we'll do it, and sooner we'll see the benefits from thereof.
I agree with that. I absolutely agree. I think it's the most economically efficient dollar Congress can appropriate is towards infrastructure spending. So we're in agreement on that. All right, LaVaughn, I have one actually really important question for you now. And this actually came in from a couple of viewers, but it's my personal question to an old friend. So there is an opening on the Federal Reserve Board currently. And given your already experience at the Federal Reserve and all these other government agencies, I think you're perfectly positioned to take on that seat at the Federal Reserve. And I would like for you to comment on your level of interest. Clearly, you're more than qualified. And I think folks like you who could explain things to the American people in a way that we understand it. Again, I would nominate you if I was president. Can you comment on that at all? I know people don't like to comment on, will I run for president or whatever, but there is that seat available. Would you be interested?
Well, Joan, let me say in all candor, and this is not the normal Washington way. Yes, I would be very interested. I would be honored to even be considered. I'm a longtime fan of the Federal Reserve and what it does. I think it's one of the smartest things our government has ever put in place and kept its hands off of, most importantly. And I've learned a lot through my time at the Federal Reserve and my maintenance of relationships with members of the Board of Governors and the presidents. In fact, the person exiting that seat is a longtime colleague of mine. We went to graduate school together, and that being Dr. Lael Brainerd. So yes, I would be honored even to be considered. And thank you for asking that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I would nominate you for our president. Listen, we've come to the end of our session with LaVaughn. It's been incredibly clear and interesting, and we'd love to have you back to update us in the
Whenever
future.
You want me to.
LaVaughn, thank you so much for your time and your energy. You put together the slides and all your talking points over the last couple of months, so we appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone attending today. Trust me, I enjoyed this more than you, I have no doubt, and I look forward to doing it again. Thanks so much, Joe.
All right, great. And folks, I just want to remind you, we do have a session coming up on ChatGPT on March 1st. So a couple of programs that we want to make sure you have on your calendars. This is going to be really interesting. It's actually our two data scientists or chief data scientist in analytics is going to talk about what ChatGPT can do for your business, for the insurance sector, and in general. So don't miss that, March 1st. And then March 15th, we're going to talk with the Department of Homeland Security's CISA, the cybersecurity agency, which was created a few years ago, about what's going on in the cyber threat landscape that they're seeing and how to protect your businesses. Cyber is also one of, as everyone knows, the top business concerns according to our risk index. So join us on March 15th. And then I'm going to have what I like to say a leadership series conversation with the CEO, and this is on March 22nd, the CEO of Stanley Black & Decker. The president and CEO, Don Allen, will join me to talk about what's going on in the major manufacturing sectors globally and what he's seeing around the corners. Just a very insightful guy. And so we're thrilled that, that Don Allen will join us from Stanley Black & Decker. So my friends, thank you for joining us. We always really appreciate your input. Fill out our survey. Go to our website for all the replays. We'll see you again on March 1st. Take care.